This is Valley Beth Shalom, College of Jewish Studies, live online, and welcome this evening. We're certainly delighted to have all of you with us tonight to celebrate Jewish learning all together, and hope that you're taking very good care in these wonderful days of Pesach. This evening, we're going to be continuing our conversation with Professor Ethan Pack of UCLA. But before I introduce the professor, just a few wonderful notes. First of all, as always, a very warm thank you to Jess and Lil Baim, our dear friends who have made all this possible by their kindness, generosity, and support for the synagogue. And I hope this holiday has been pleasant for them and for their families, as well as everybody. And thank you for making College of Jewish Studies possible. Just a few announcements of things going on here in the shul. Today, of course, tonight begins the last night of Chol HaMoed. Tomorrow night and Friday is Yontif again, the seventh day of Passover. And we will have morning prayers at the synagogue at 9:30 in the morning. And everyone, of course, is welcome in person as well as on Facebook and YouTube. On Shabbat, Torah study at 9 o'clock in the morning. And then at 9:30, we will have prayers in person and on Facebook and YouTube. And at about 11, I'd say about 11:30 on Saturday morning, we will recite the Yizkor prayers. So anyone who's remembering a loved one, anyone who is gathering in the memories of someone they care for, join us for the Yizkor prayers and remember those whom we cherish and celebrate the last day of Pesach. That evening, of course, Pesach will be over as soon as there are 3 stars in the sky. So if you do have a penchant for pizza, be sure to be careful because there'll be a lot of Jews lining up at Little Caesars and Domino's and all the other places, okay? And then, of course, the week that's coming is a very special week in the Jewish year. As we finish Passover, we begin the celebration of 2 very important holidays. And in terms of our conversation about Israeli identity, 2 of the critical holidays, I often say the high holidays for Israelis, Yom HaShoah, which is celebrated a week from tonight, and Yom HaAtzmaut, which will be celebrated 2 weeks from tonight. And our guest teacher next week and the week following will be Rachel Korazim. Rachel has been with us many times before. She is a master of Jewish literature, Hebrew literature, and a wonderful, wonderful teacher. And she'll be talking to us about how Israelis remember the Holocaust and how Israelis celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut yesterday and today. Those will be our sessions. And with that, we'll be closing our series. I hope that you've enjoyed this series. I certainly have gotten so much out of it. And you'll find recordings of all of these sessions at the VBS archives on YouTube, as well as if you click on the VBS website, you'll find the recordings or the links there at the Pro-Israel, No Israel website. You'll notice that there's a place there, a button called Course Notes. And if you click on that, you'll find all of the references that Professor Pack has offered us, all of the wonderful literature that he shared with us, as well as all the notes from all the other lectures. So if you missed one of the lectures, go back and catch it. Every one of them has been so valuable and so insightful. And I'm certainly glad that everybody's with us tonight. Once again, I want to introduce our guest speaker. Professor Ethan Pack is a research fellow at UCLA in the Nazarian Center. He actually is a graduate of the Kansas City Jewish Day School. He was a student of my cousin, my aunt, actually, who taught him. So my family's very proud of him. And his family's been with us for these sessions, which is very sweet. And today he's made wonderful impact as a wonderful teacher of Israeli literature and Israeli culture at UCLA. We've done 2 sessions now on literature, yesterday and today, and tonight we're going to switch gears and talk about Israeli culture filtered through Israeli television and film. Professor Ethan, it's good to have you back. Mazel tov on your brother's wedding, and Hag Sameach to you and to your family.
Thank you, Rabbi Feinstein. Yes, so Hag Sameach l'kulam to everybody. Happy Pesach, and to our hosts, thank you so much again for making this possible. And you mentioned the Hebrew Academy in Kansas City. There's 1, if not 2, alumni in the Zoom now too. So the good plug for day school, I guess you could say. So tonight we're gonna shift gears slightly and talk about television and film. And a little more emphasis maybe on Israeli television, just because lately, the last 3-4 years, very, very recently, Israeli television seems to have had this unprecedented boom in its distribution and its viewership, not just in America, but all over the world, as I'll discuss. So before I get into some of the how did that happen, I'm going to make, at the beginning of the first lecture, you may remember I made a few general comments on like, what is literature? What is it doing? Especially with regards to Israel, we're used to looking at Israel through other media, like journalism or political science, media that present the objective, the sort of the outside, the external. Unfortunately, if I give you an example from the last few days, it wouldn't, there's been a lot of bad news, but you could even say, people gather in Israel for Yom Tov or at the Kotel or whatever. That's an objective fact. It doesn't tell you what it feels like to be there. It just tells you that happened. And literature, as I was saying earlier, is the sort of meeting point between the objective external reality that is represented for us in many other media, and the subjective, the internal, the multi-layered perceptions, emotions, unconscious thoughts, beliefs that we have. Literature mediates between those two things. And you may think, okay, so Ethan sold me that literature does something unique, that it has this observation of the external world, but it also has this internal psychological texture. But that's literature, and we're talking about TV tonight, and as if there's like a big division. And so the first thing I want to do is to knock down that division with television and with film. Let's put them together and just call them, motion pictures. And we're so used to thinking of cinema and television very, very far from literature. We think of it maybe because of the star system or all the production elements that, hundreds of people that go into making a show or a movie. It seems so far from sitting at home with your book, in your chair reading privately. And I want to propose to think of it a little differently. What is a motion picture, right? It is literature plus photography. It's a very, very simple equation. It is a work of literature, a work of text meant to be recited, meant to be read out loud in a performative way, that is photographed. And if we're talking about celluloid before digital, it's 24 photographs per second. You run them together really fast, and you have a motion picture. You have 1 second of film. And so if you just take the sort of innate, you don't have to be an expert in photography, but we all look at a photograph and we say, oh, that's beautiful, or look at the composition, or I just had my brother's wedding, 1 million photographs, right? Your collar's not right, tuck that in, make sure your hands are in your pockets. What makes a photograph work or not work is being combined with what makes a literary text work or not work. And you may say, no, but a literary text is a book that I read in private, and it's not private when they write a screenplay and they perform it. So again, push back against that perception, because I want us to appreciate how Israeli literature, Hebrew literature, is really thinking there's a term like the woof and the warp. It's like a weaving term of Israeli television and cinema. So what's the oldest? You take an intro to Western literature class. The oldest form of Western literature is Greek tragedy. Literature, as something that we do in private and we read it silently in our heads, is a very recent innovation. Goes to the late 18th century. What literature has meant for most of human history is people in public getting together and watching other people recite a text or perform a text. It's often a text that they had memorized. So if you go even before Greek tragedy, you have the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are, now you can buy, it's propping up my laptop, I won't show you, but the Odyssey is 24 books, it's a few hundred pages, but for perhaps over 1,000 years, it was an oral text that was recited in public, and listeners had heard it many times and related to it as something that they saw and heard and not just read, right? Because most people were not literate until about 100, 150 years ago. The same with the Torah. Biblical scholars now believe that before the Torah was committed to text, it spent a few hundred years as an oral text, as something that was recited publicly, and only with time made its way into text form. So whether you're with the Greeks or you're with the Hebrews, or you think of who's the best writer of all time in any genre, William Shakespeare, again, dramatic text. So what makes literature literature in its almost oldest, even most authentic iteration is performance. And that is what you have, even if you're watching Shtisel, an Israeli television show, or you're watching Waltz with Bashir, an Israeli Academy Award nominated film. You're watching a piece of literature, but you're also have that photographic element. So just that's the sort of table setting I wanted to do to set up this medium. Okay, so let's speak briefly about Israeli film. I'm not going to give you the whole history of the first film was in this year and it was this and that and the other. And Israeli film, I'm going to speak just quite broadly to say that relative to Israel's population, certainly, it punches above its weight. Even before there was TV streaming and all that kind of TV stuff, if you look at the frequency with which Israeli films have been nominated for what used to be called the Oscar for the best foreign film, now they call it, I think, the best international film or something. They're always changing it, but what happens is every country in the world that wants to submits a candidate. They pick their best picture and they say, we're Germany, here's our best picture, we're Japan, here's ours. And then the Academy picks 5 films. And they've done this at least since the mid-century. So the odds that a country is going to get picked, year after year are pretty low. There are a few countries that seem to really excel. South Korea, Romania, so this is something you wouldn't expect, actually Iran. And Israel is one of these countries that has a national cinema that is really well regarded outside of Israel. Not just in America, by the way. In fact, Israel is a very frequent winner at Cannes and at the Venice Film Festival. And these European film festivals, they happen in the spring and summer, are often actually what gets the ball rolling for what the Golden Globes and the Oscars in America are going to choose. So in many ways, it's actually Israeli film's reception in Europe, which has been very strong, has led to a strong critical reception in the US. And one thing people ask me when it comes to film and TV, and we'll keep this in mind, it's another through line of my talk tonight, is, well, does Israeli televisual media do so well because American Jews, we can say between us, run Hollywood, right? Like we live here, we know that we are very prominent. We kind of invented Hollywood, to put a fine point on it. And I think there's something there, but the fact that Israeli film does so well in Europe, where Jews are not the ones running the entertainment industry or the critical reception of entertainment, it speaks to the, I think, quality of Israeli film. I looked, it's something like the average has been like once every 4 or 5 years that they make it into the top 5, which is pretty impressive. And the maybe other way I would just mention, another thing I'd mention about Israeli film, and later in the kind of middle end of the lecture, I'm going to play us some scenes from some films and some shows. But is that there is a worry, there has been a worry since Hollywood, was invented. They were worrying about it in the 20s in Weimar, Germany. Will Hollywood, in the size and scale of these, massive budget movies, these blockbusters, will that flatten all the other national cinema styles? Will everyone just copy Hollywood because none of us have the kind of resources they do? And will we end up just with, a different version of Hollywood coming out of every country? And remarkably, that hasn't happened. And Israel is a good example, maybe even a unique example of why. If Hollywood wants to make a detective movie, they don't need to go find an Israeli movie. They know how to do it. And they kind of, you could say, have that down. If they want a horror movie, any kind of genre, you could think of Hollywood will probably turn to itself first. Part of what Hollywood or distributors are turning to when they watch Israeli films is show us something that we can't make here. Show us something that we wouldn't even think to make here because our society is different, because our aesthetics are different, because we just look at the world differently. So I'm teaching a class right now on Israeli film. It's on Israeli film, TV, and literature. It's called Israel on Screen at UCLA. And in Pirkei Avot, it says, a teacher says, I learned the most from my students. Mitzalmidai hachamti. I've become wise from my students. So I say the same thing. I had a student a few weeks ago presenting, and he was saying how there's these invisible limits of what does and doesn't get produced in America or anywhere. Some of it has to do with money, but what's palpable, what will critics like? There's a lot of different criteria. And every now and then a film might come along, I think, Pulp Fiction or something that does something that used to be not allowed. If you did that, your movie wouldn't get off the ground. But for some reason it gets made and people say, oh, wow, you can tell a story out of order. Wow, let's do that. A lot of the Israeli films that have broken through have been very innovative and in many ways broken a lot of rules or broken new ground on how cinema can tell a story. And in that, I think, is a source of a lot of their appeal. And that will also be relevant to television. So now I'm going to tell you Israeli television a little bit. You catch your breath, I'll take a sip. Israeli television, I'm going to give you a little more of the nuts and bolts of the history because I think it's interesting and also more has changed than in Israeli cinema in recent years. So Israeli TV starts in 1965. Television is illegal until that time because there is a fear, under the Ben Gurion labor governments, the strong Zionist socialist ideology was very resistant towards certain things that they thought were going to dilute the culture, lead to westernization, etc. And in 1965, Israel allows the creation of Channel 1, and it's basically modeled on the BBC. It's one channel. You buy a television set, you plug it in, that's what you get. There's no alternatives. It has news, it has scripted drama, it has a variety of different things. And the idea, of course, as with the BBC, was to kind of create a common ground and a common denominator for the culture. Commercial TV in Israel doesn't start until the late 80s. And they changed the laws in the late 80s to allow for another channel. And in a feat of creativity, this other channel is called Channel 2. And for a while, they used to have Channel 1 and Channel 2. And the only difference is Channel 2 has commercials, which just are the socialist Zionist ideologues of yore. That would have been Treif. But Israel, this is sort of a period globally where socialism is kind of buckling a bit, and Israel embraces the commercial model. So now, the paper towel company in Israel is going to advertise on Channel 2. There are dramas on these two channels, some of them quite good, that are adapted later. But there's a giant breakthrough in Israel that happens in 2005, which the technological breakthrough happened in the US as well, but it led to an artistic breakthrough in Israel that was unique. And that was in 2005, Israeli television first rolled out video on demand, meaning if you want to watch the show, whatever the show is, you don't have to sit down like tonight, Wednesday at 7. It'll be, once it airs, it'll be in a bank that you can kind of access anytime. So now you're choosing when you watch something, not what you watch. They're still choosing that, but you're choosing, I can watch it Wednesday at 7, or I could watch it Saturday morning after show or whatever. Later in that year, they introduced DVR, the ability to record live television. And it's actually, to this day, used much more in Israel than it is in the global average, even where it's available in other places. And immediately, a show takes advantage of this shift, where now viewers are going to be choosing what they want to watch, when they want to watch it, and it's going to change the way creators approach things. I'll just really quick tell you the commercial side of that. Before on-demand and DVR, and what I'm about to say here does apply in America, and there was a similar change in Britain. You rely on commercials. So that is going to probably, you're not going to write The Sopranos if you need to sell diapers and, paper towels to American families. A lot of wholesome companies do not want to advertise on shows that have a lot of violence or a lot of sexuality, or even are maybe difficult to follow and aren't going to have large audiences. When you shift to a sort of the viewer has more agency, what the studios realize is that, and really actually the show that kind of does this in America was Mad Men, is the network AMC decided, we're not going to make a lot of money on Mad Men. We're going to cultivate a very refined audience that is very committed. So instead of looking for the 20 million people or 30 million people that watched Cheers on NBC in 1988, we're looking for like 1 or 2 million viewers, but viewers who are so dedicated to this show and that they'll go wherever the show goes aesthetically, they will follow. You can challenge them, they want to be challenged. And it will create like an identity that we're the network that does this artistically. We create this like high art thing. And once we have that identity, that is appealing for viewers and for advertisers. They may not end up, the advertisers may end up wanting to advertise on some other show that not Mad Men, the audience is too small, but now you've put specific groups of viewers kind of in the driver's seat for content. Here's what Israel does with that, not Israel, but some very, very smart Israeli television writers created a show called In Treatment, B'Tipul. And B'Tipul airs 5 nights a week. Every single episode takes place in a psychiatrist's office. And the psychiatrist on Monday, he sees a pilot, an Israeli Air Force pilot who has PTSD. On Tuesday, he sees a suicidal teen. On Wednesday, he sees a woman who is in love with him, even though he's married, a patient who's in love with him. Thursday, he sees a couple, and then Friday, he goes to his own therapist. That let the viewer doesn't have to watch all of that. The viewer can say, I really love the couple. I love that couple. I don't like the PTSD, too macho violence. I like the couple. And so they're going to watch on Thursday. Someone else may say, I love the PTSD. It's so provocative and what did he do and how does he reckon with his feelings and how does the psychiatrist guide him? I'm going to watch on Mondays. And so the show cultivated, they had a 9-week run, 5 episodes a week. That's a lot, by the way. That's 45 episodes. Most cable shows are 22 at the most on like a Cheers would be like a 22, Mad Men would be like 13. So they had this enormous amount of content. It ended up, by the way, also apparently leading to a big surge in interest in the field of psychiatry. Some say it even psychologized other Israeli content. So then you have another show called Euphoria about teens with PTSD, which then gets adapted by HBO. So you may know the story now. In Treatment gets adapted by HBO. In Treatment is ultimately adapted in 20 different countries: Japan, Serbia, Brazil, Argentina. And what happens from there is a lot of other countries start looking at it to Israel to say, they're doing stuff there that we love this idea, or we love this formal innovation, and we want to try it here. And that has continued, the adaptation trend. Now, the adaptation trend isn't that they screen B'tipul in Hebrew with subtitles. The adaptation is you cast a local cast in Japan or Brazil or whatever. Something else changes once we jump 10 years into the future, and you have Netflix. Now we're totally separated from television networks, and you have the streaming content where Netflix can just buy content, and through the internet you can play it anytime you want. And Netflix, on the cheap, buys a lot of foreign content. They buy Scandinavian detective shows, and they buy 2 Israeli shows, Fauda, a thriller about an undercover unit of the Israeli military that works in the West Bank, and Shtisel, about an ultra-Orthodox family living in Mea Sharim in Jerusalem. Actually, I think they might live in Sanhedrin, but it doesn't matter, living in Jerusalem. And lo and behold, these shows are hits. And a lot of people, when I tell them this, they're like, well, of course, like, we all watch Fauda, we're Jews, it's interesting to us, blah, blah, blah. I read an article by the head of distribution for Hot, which is the Israeli network that produces Fauda. Was it Hot or Yes? Yes, I'm sorry, it's Yes. Those are their 2 networks. And Fauda right now is the biggest in India. Shtisel right now is the biggest in Italy. And they trace this by Facebook involvement and just overall social media use. Netflix gives them some confidential numbers. So these are not shows that are just like, oh, well, Jews in LA or Jews in America are connecting because it's Jews and it's Israel. These are shows that are really holding their own water aesthetically. And maybe, it stands to reason that Israel is a place that has heightened interest, perhaps more than New Zealand or some other countries. And maybe that is also part of the appeal of these shows. But it's not all conflict driven, because Shtisel there's very little conflict, period, but none of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But what's the innovation here? Shtisel and Fauda are aired in Hebrew with subtitles. And why does that work? And why is that interesting? It works because you couldn't shoot Shtisel in Brazil or Japan with the local actors and cast, because there aren't ultra-Orthodox Jews in Brazil and Japan in this type of way that they are in Jerusalem. So there's aspects of the Israeli reality, it's kind of like with the film, where it's desirable precisely because it can only happen there. And they've tried some of these shows adapting them. A lot of them, if they're about the conflict, if they're about something culturally specific, they do terribly when they're adapted into a foreign language. And the ones that do well are the ones that are more about family and psychological issues, like In Treatment and Euphoria. Also, On the Spectrum, a show, it's the first show to use a cast of autistic people to make a show about autism. So it's a global era of television anyway. And I could give this lecture about, Scandinavian detective shows or French satire or whatever. But Israel being a relatively small country in a language that has, France has a giant, former empire of Francophone speakers. There's not that for Hebrew. It is pretty remarkable the way this Israeli television has traveled And even when it comes full circle is when the Israeli creators are then asked to come to Hollywood and make stuff here. And it's interesting, by the way, that not all of them elect to do that. A lot of them prefer to work in Israel. The creators of Ph.D. did make a show for Netflix. It seems like it's going to be a one and done kind of thing. It didn't do so well. And it was set in New York and in Israel. So it's just kind of interesting there. And the last thing I'll mention about the TV trends is that there's kind of a feedback loop. So I think it was 2007, Israel had a show called Hatufim about, it was actually written before Gilad Shalit, the Israeli corporal, was kidnapped by Hamas and held in captivity for like 5 or 6 years. But Hatufim was about kidnapped Israelis who are coming back to the home front and, what's changed while they've been gone. And so one of the writers of that show and some American writers who had written a show in America called 24 got together and said, we're going to adapt it and we're going to call it Homeland. And they made this very successful show on on Showtime called Homeland. Homeland kind of worked because it aired when America was still at the tail end of kind of the war on terror, not that it's not still happening, but of an interest in that theme, interest in the fact that America had, soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they made a lot of changes for Homeland, but I would argue, or many have argued, that Homeland wouldn't work today. Homeland worked because it was still sort of at the tail end of the 9/11 decade. In a way, Homeland was kind of a critique of 24, which of their own earlier show, more nuanced version. Now, you're not going to get an adaptation of Ph.D. called, Homeland 2 or something, because it's not really, America's not in this global terror moment. We have other issues that are kind of major issues, and it's not a better or worse, but that for an issue like that, what that's going to lead to is the Israeli shows that deal with that issue, they're going to probably be aired and purchased in the original language, like Tehran by Apple TV and so on. So that is just some interesting TV kind of the nuts and bolts and how it works. Now we're going to go a little deeper. So, brace yourselves. This will, in a way, this will be like less to track where I'm going next. I talked, and you gracefully listened in the first lecture about what is this giant change of creating Israeli statehood? Like, how does that change literature? And really, in Hebrew's case, in Israel's case, really, you could say the literature changed the reality to create statehood. And where I left things off at the end of the first lecture, we talking about 1948, was how do you transition into normal life as a nation after 2,000 years of waiting, of not being a nation in this way, of not having national sovereignty or territory? And the Israelis, the first Israelis, as Tom Segev calls them, they came to revolutionize Jewish life. That's important to remember. They came to create a break. So a lot of us of a certain generation may remember hearing people say, I'm not Jewish, I'm Israeli. And that would, irk a lot of people. They weren't saying, like, instead of being Jewish, I'm Israeli. What they were saying was that Jewish is this one small thing that you do from time to time. And Israeli is our entire reality. Israeli is the language we're speaking all the time. Israeli is the street signs. Israeli is, why do 99% of Israeli Jews do the Seder? Because what are you going to do on Leil Seder in Israel if you're not at a Seder? There's nothing to do. There's that kind of force of the majority in predominant practices, right? So they wanted to create this new Jew where that became the Israeli, their Judaism isn't just something that happens in synagogue. It happens in their relationship to their landscape. It happens in their language. It also happens in their mentality. The idea Jews have been too much in these texts, not just the novels and the poem, but the Talmud and the Midrash and the Torah and the comment on the comment and the halacha and the dissenting opinion. We need to get out of these texts and into the world. You could almost say out of Alt-Neuland, this German Jewish novel, and into Tel Aviv, the city that they created after Alt-Neuland. We need to act instead of thinking so much. We need to go out into the world, outdoors, quite literally, into nature, and instead of being in the synagogue and in the indoors. We also, there was a belief that there was too much maybe neurosis in the Jewish history, and that the Israeli Jew would act, and maybe even at the cost of not expressing emotions, not even maybe feeling emotions, to be stoic, to be Spartan, to not complain. How long was that going to last, right? To make sacrifices and kind of speak with your actions. So it's a great idea. And a lot of things happened as a result. And we have a country of 9 million people to show for it. But in its very success, you already have the seed of its own contradiction, which is any country that is in reality, and not just in someone's head, is going to have people who are writing what they feel about living in that reality. They're going to write novels to be like, this is what it's like here. This is what it's like to be a forest watcher here. This is what it's like to be a soldier here. Maybe they'll write poems. Maybe they'll make a TV series. Maybe they'll make a movie. The thing of we'll get out of the text and into reality, we'll get out of reflexivity and into decisive action. Well, action always it becomes the script for the next commentary, if you think about it. And so not that they wanted to get rid of literature, far from it. They really held literature in high regard. But what does literature do? As I said at the beginning, it's not just the external world, the facts on the ground. It's the way our consciousness internally, processes that and thinks about that, and our emotions and all that. And so the question that I pose to you is Israeli literature, and in that I include film and I include television, is that a fulfillment of the Zionist vision? Because it's reflecting a national life, not a diasporic life. It's reflecting this landscape and this language and this mentality. It's representing those things in narrative or in poetry. So is it a fulfillment, or is it a sort of contradiction or a thorn in the side? Because just by virtue of becoming a text again, are we back into this, complaining, neurotic, etc. So that's a tension. And you won't be surprised to find out or to realize that Israeli film and television reflect this tension just as much as literature. And they have been the sites, some of the primary sites where all of the subjective consciousnesses, all the people who didn't fit perfectly into that, stoic Zionist, man of action. So maybe you make a film to depict, well, what's it like to be a Mizrahi immigrant into this whole thing? What's it like to be a Moroccan Jewish immigrant? What's it like to be a woman who survived the Holocaust? What's it like to be an ultra-Orthodox Jew in this country that's supposed to be like secular and, and all this kind of stuff? And so what you're seeing in whether it's in Shtisel or and I'm going to play a clip or two, is you're seeing the conversation that in some ways is the response to this revolutionary creation of a new reality is, okay, well, what does that reality actually look and feel and smell like how do you depict that reality in narrative or in cinema or photographic narrative? How do you shoot it? Is this something that everyone wants to participate in or not? Is this something that everyone wants to belong to or not, or feels that they can belong to? And so the examples are endless. I'm going to try to show, we'll see how I do on time, but I'm going to start by showing a clip from a film, Salah Shabbat. It's from the 1960s. Salah Shabbat was actually written by an Ashkenazi satirist named Ephraim Kishon, who was kind of the king of Israeli satire in that era. But it's about an immigrant, and sorry, there's like really loud crows. I hope it's not coming through on the audio. It's about an immigrant to the new state of Israel, who's probably arriving in the early 1950s. They never tell you where he's from, but a lot of suggestions, from the Arab world, certainly, probably from Yemen, who is sent, as hundreds of thousands of these immigrants were, to the Ma'abarot, these transit camps that were meant to be temporary but lasted for a number of years and led to a sort of two-track socioeconomic reality in Israel. So this is already being made over a decade after that wave of immigrants came. And you may remember, Israel's population in 48, 600,000. After 51, it's 1.3 million. It more than doubles with the immigrants who came, some Holocaust survivors from Europe, about 300,000 Holocaust survivors from Europe, and about 400,000 Jews from the Muslim world. So Salah Shabbat is the satire. In the scene I'm about to show, Salah, that's the guy's name, his name is Salah Shabbat, he has been hired, along with a lot of these other immigrants, to plant a new forest. And if you may remember from my second lecture, Facing the Forest, the forest, the JNF forest, is a big site of the creative imagination. So he's in this forest, not really that into the work. And I'll show you the scene here. Hopefully my screen, oops, that is not the one that I wanted. Or is it? Ilana, is it a black and white photo that's up there now?
No, it's not.
Okay, sorry. Okay, now should be. Okay, so this guy in the middle is Salah Shabbat, played by Avram Topol, who later played the Fiddler on the Roof. But here we go.
این شرط بیشکیلا دونه خد شترانه تا کسب بیشکیلا یار از دیدی بابا سیمخا How do you do? Mrs. and Mr. Birnbaum, this is your forest. After me, please. Thank you.
Now I'm going to skip a little something that happens shortly thereafter. So they leave.
زایونات تایروت یدیدی کل خدرات شرط میشلا اول جلو یا فعلون جک مشکر جه How do you do? After me, please. Mrs. and Mr. Sonnenschein, this is your forest. What the hell's going on here? Hey! Tafsik! Hey! Tafsik! 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 Ato po! يجي هيا عرش لدون بوربوي مش بالآلة تاريخ العصود يعر حدث أتا بفدار علي كاين أتا بروح الشيخ.
So now I can stop the timer on my side. So I mean the scene speaks pretty well for itself. If I had more time, I'd go into it, but it's very funny. And I mean, it's amazing. And you see also one thing that I'm going to call attention to besides all the obvious things is an awareness that the way Israel presents itself and the story it tells to Diaspora Jury, American Jury, is an important part of the larger, its own narrative. So this film is made for Israelis primarily. It was nominated, it won the Golden Globe for Best Foreign Film and was the first Israeli film nominated for the Oscar for Best Foreign Film. But even in their own internal conversations, primary audience, there's this thing of the way we tell the story, the way they hear the story, that matters. So I'm going to show now a much harder clip to watch. And this will be I'm only going to do two, I think, because of time. So this clip is from the HBO show Our Boys, which was made in 2019 by 3 Israeli directors and collaborated. One Palestinian citizen of Israel and the other 2 Jewish. And they're all very well renowned. One of them had been the creator of In Treatment, Chagai Levi. One of them, Yosef Sadar, made a movie called Lebanon and another called Foxtrot that were both nominated for the Oscar. So 2 for 2, pretty amazing guy. They all got together and they made this show for HBO, which you may have seen. Really quickly, it's about the events of 2014, which I had called bad fortune to be in Israel for these events, where in June, 3 teenagers, I think they're all 17, were hitchhiking in the West Bank, Israeli settlers. They were kidnapped. And for about 3 weeks, the Israeli public didn't know if they were alive or not. And a lot of emotion was stirred up by the hope that they were alive. And then at the end of an investigation, they found the Israeli security services found their bodies, found out that they were indeed actually killed during the kidnapping. And what I'm telling you now is what happened in reality. It's also depicted in the show. The night after it was found that they were killed, 3 Israeli Jews from the Jerusalem area kidnapped a Palestinian teenager and tortured him and burned him to death. And this is part of what led to the war Operation Protective Edge, Misat Tzuk Eitan, in the summer of 2014 between Israel and Hamas. So the show doesn't go into the war. The first episode is about those 3 weeks when the Israeli public is kind of waiting on pins and needles to find out if these boys are alive. And the first episode concludes with the discovery that they're not. And by the way, the show was I think Netanyahu, the prime minister at the time, particularly got into a spat with HBO about the show. The show was produced in Israel and then distributed by HBO, but made in Israel. So the scene I'm going to show you there, the show is looking at these events from 3 different perspectives. The perspective of different suspects of who kidnapped the Arab boy, and they don't tell you which ones are actually the guilty party till later in the show. The perspective of that boy himself, and then the perspective of a Shin Bet security officer who's in charge of tracking Jewish fundamentalists. And so once found out that the boys were killed, he's looking to make sure that nothing like this happens, even it does happen. And the reason, part of the reason this clip will be interesting is because you may remember from the very first lecture, I showed the poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik, that really, in a way, this poem made Hebrew a national language, you could almost say, of Jewish people in the diaspora. From 1903, it's called Al Hashchita, on the slaughter. The title being from the blessing that is said before slaughtering an animal in kosher slaughter. And Bialik went to yeshiva. As you can see from this picture, he left yeshiva. But after the pogrom in Kishinev, in what's now Moldova, in which 49 Jews were killed and dozens of women raped and the town, the Jewish part of the town destroyed, he wrote this poem on the slaughter, Al Hashchita. And it's kind of a protest against a God that would let this happen and a world that would let this happen. And I want to call your attention to the last two verses. And you may think, wait, we were just in 2014, how are we now in 1903? But it'll all come together, and that's where I'll conclude. So in the last two verses, he said, if there is justice, let it come now. But if it should come after I've been blotted out beneath the sky, let its throne, the throne of heaven, be cast down. Let the heavens rot in evil everlasting. So basically, Bialik is saying, if God cannot provide justice for the slaughter of innocent Jews now, then let heaven be overthrown. But then he ends with an interesting, perhaps, I don't know if you call it a caveat or an epilogue to that. And cursed be he who cries out revenge. He says, Arur shomrim nekama. Vengeance like this for the blood of a child, Satan has yet to devise. Oda Satan Lovara. So he's saying, this is a horrible evil. This is an evil that is causing me and many Jews to lose our faith in God. But whether God does anything about it or not, we will not take revenge, because the type of revenge that would be necessary to avenge the death of a child would be diabolical. Only a satanic act could possibly avenge something this awful. So it's morally, it's a very interesting statement. What ends up happening, as you'll see in the scene that I play, is that when the bodies of the three boys were discovered, there's an enormous spontaneous demonstration in Jerusalem, in a part of Jerusalem that if you've been there, you've probably been there, on Rehov Yafo, on Jaffa Street, the main thoroughfare, of Jews, mostly right-wing religious Jews, chanting nakama, nakama, vengeance, vengeance. And Netanyahu went on television and he quoted this poem. He says, revenge for the blood of a child, Satan has yet to devise. And it was an interesting quotation because there was other things that he said that seemed to encourage revenge, but he was quoting this Bialik poem. So I'm going to play you the scene and then I'm going to wrap it up and go to questions. So we now go to the scene. And so let's see here, 28. This boy, the boy in the orange t-shirt, is the one who will eventually, it's not shown on screen in this episode, but he is the boy who's ultimately kidnapped and burned to death. And you don't know when it's going to happen. And all you know is that he's gone into the west part of Jerusalem, the Jewish part of Jerusalem. He's a Palestinian from East Jerusalem, does not speak Hebrew. He's gone in to work at a pizza shop when this news comes over the airwaves.
You שלום. טוב, אתה רוצה לעשות משמרת ניסיון? איך העברית שלך? אתה יודע לדבר עברית? ביי, אחי. טוב, תראה מה נעשה. קח אותו, תן לו את הטאג של שמואל בינתיים, שלא ידבר ערבית. בסדר? תסיים איתו ואז תחזור למטבח. סבבה?
אני מגלה אסור לו גם את העצם. פתאום בוקר טוב אמא, לילה טוב אמא, תתלבש, תוריד. לא מתאים.
נכון, אני לא רוצה להיות מוכר, מה תכריח אותה? אני רוצה להיות ליד הילדים שלה.
טוב, חלה, סבבה.
רק לך יש את החדר הכי פנוי לכולם,
לא יעבוד על מי.
So I'm having trouble finding the exact moment. Basically, they cut to just for time's sake, I'm gonna cut it here, but you get the idea. They're juxtaposing this protest, and they cut to Netanyahu quoting the Bialik poem. What makes this a really powerful moment, cinematically, literarily, historically, politically, everything, is that and so that there's an American-Israeli poet named Peter Cole who wrote an essay about this. Bialik wrote his poem in the Tsarist Russian Empire, where there was no territory, there was no national language, there was no sovereignty, etc. And if you might remember from the first lecture, I quoted a poet from 1936 writing about the Arab-Jewish violence in 36, and he says, this is not Kishinev. Yes, we're dying here, but this is not Kishinev. In Kishinev, they die in vain, and here we die for the future. In Kishinev, they have nothing but shame and powerlessness, and here we have heroism and redemption, and and we're dying for something. And like basically, if you understand what Zionism is that when we even our lives are at risk, even that we fight, even if we die, also by the way, even if they kill, that it is not the same as in the diaspora. And when Netanyahu brings the Bialik poem, of all poems and of all lines, a very famous line, I see there was no audio. Well, didn't matter, there was subtitles, and I think you're getting the overall effect. When Netanyahu brings that poem, he's in some ways kind of piercing a wall that was the Zionists built at the very beginning. And it's the wall that says Jewish history, the history of victimhood, the history of Kishinev, the history of even the Holocaust. They built this wall at great cost. That's over here. And what we're doing here is different. We are a nation. We are a nation. In what is a nation? It's a modern nation state, just like Japan, just like New Zealand. And what we have more in common with the other nations, because we are a nation state, than with the history of the Jewish people who were not a sovereign nation. That was the idea. And over time, that has been eroded in many ways. And you go from this is not Kishinev to talking about the victims as if they're victims of pogrom in Kishinev. So where I'm going to conclude with that is a thing that is brought to my attention not infrequently. And I've only showed you that riot, which I guess you didn't see. I didn't hear the audio, but it's very disturbing. And I was there in person. I've been there in person other times when, there's a wall-to-wall of Jewish youth chanting, Mavet l'Aravim, death to Arabs, or Nekama, Nekama. And I'm not going to tell you who to spoil the surprise, but some of the characters they show are the ones who ended up kidnapping and burning that boy. And so what people will say to me is, okay, so these films, they're winning whatever, the Oscar, or they're getting a lot of distribution. But if it's Fauda, if it's Lebanon, if it's Waltz with Bashir, they're not making Israel look good. And that objection is a really interesting objection because it raises, I think, the entire stakes of what Israel and Israeli literature and art are, which is where I'm going to conclude. For one thing, I'll say anecdotally, having taught this stuff for 10, 11 years, I've never shown any of that type of material and had a non-Jewish student come out like, quote unquote, more anti-Israel. In fact, it's almost always the opposite reaction. And that's just empirically my experience. And if you think about it, there's reasons why that would be. But as American Jews, we have 3 ways of reading these novels or watching this stuff. And they're all in conflict. And part of the conflict is because Israel itself is in conflict about these things. Part of it is we watch this stuff, these films, let's say Our Boys. And part of us thinks that we're watching Kishinev. We're watching an embattled, endangered, vulnerable group of Jews, and they're threatened, and we have to protect them. And in a way, it's assuaging our guilt about our lack of agency to protect the Jews of Europe in the Holocaust. But it is if you really get down to nuts and bolts, that is actually a very anti-Zionist way of thinking about it, because it's looking at the Jews in Israel as if they're still in a pre-state, pre-sovereignty world. But these are our instincts, and they've been cultivated over 2,000 years, and they're not going to go away overnight. That's one way. The complete radical opposite of that is to, and this is what Ben Gurion and especially the leaders of the state in its first 30 years, the labor leadership wanted, is we are Israeli, we are not Jews, which is to say, we're a country. We're going to go to war. We're going to write books about the war. We're going to write poems about the war. We're going to eventually make films about the war. Not everything we do is going to, look good or fit into the story of Jewish history, because this is not the story of Jewish history. This is a new history. This is a national history. And nations have problems. Nations have complex realities. They have ethnic divisions that we saw, religious divisions, and those are going to get reflected. That's, we're all in. Our chips are in, and we have created a country, even though it entails all these forms of struggle and perhaps even shame and embarrassment that were not on the table when we were not sovereign people. And in the middle of these two tendencies is the idea we're watching Our Boys. One is you could watch that like you're watching a movie, like you're watching Parasite from South Korea, or you're watching, a movie from Australia. One is you could watch it like you're watching a pogrom 100 years ago. But the third is that Israel is the representative of Jewish identity par excellence. That yes, it's a sovereign country. It's not like a ghetto in Moldova, but as Jews, we're Jews, and they're like more Jews. They're like the most public, visible type of Jews in the world. And so even if they do things that every country does, it's tricky for us because there's some, like, yes, we're in the diaspora and they're there, but there's some kind of subterranean connection that binds us. And obviously they have an awareness of this connection too, whether it's the signs in the JNF forest or it's Netanyahu's quoting the poem. And how we negotiate this when we see these representations of Israeli life, I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's literature's job to make Israel look good, because that would basically undo the entire Zionist project of having a country, and countries have have literature, and literature reflects reality, and reality is full of challenges. But I do see that, especially for us as viewers, it's a little complicated, and we're being pulled in on different levels: a paternalistic level, a sort of smaller cousin level, and then just a human, global level. And so I'll end there, but I think those are the stakes.
Thank you, Professor. I want to take that up. I love the presentation, and first of all, I love Salah Shabbat because that's one of the great movies. And that particular scene, if you've ever been in Israel and see, I remember I went to the Hebrew University for 2 years, and I lived in the dormitories, and I'm not making this up. There was one plaque on the outside of my door and one plaque on the inside of my door. And I'm sure they did that with the donors. I'm sure they brought Mrs. Scheinbaum to show the outside and Mr. Finkelstein to see the inside. And they took great pride that they donated my room. It's just a question of how there's something so Israeli about that and so Jewish about that. And that film is so funny and so self-critical. And I have not seen the Our Boys, but I was in Israel during that time. I was there studying at Hartman Institute. And I remember the heartbreak of the night those boys were discovered, the bodies were discovered, and then the overwhelming heartbreak over what had happened to the Arab teenager that had been done by Israelis. And it was such I'm seeing you captured there in the film. It's such a moment of self-reflection. So here is my Rashi, my commentary on your wonderful conclusion at the end. So you said that there's 3 possible ways of approaching this. First, that to see Israel as vulnerable and our job is to protect her. And therefore, everything that's shown about Israel should always be positive because there's enough Israel haters in the world already. We don't need to create any new ones, although your wonderful caveat that never having shown these films or exposed people to this literature, did they love Israel any less? The second possibility is to simply say we're normal. That's what Zionism was supposed to do, is make us normal. And like any normal country, we have moral triumphs and moral disappointments, and our literature, our literary creativity reflects that. And then the third thing that you pointed out was that Israel is the most visible evidence of Jewish identity in the world. And therefore, this is, it's fair game to critique. I want to go deeper with that one because maybe we can have the conversation with everyone. I think it's deep within the Jewish character to be self-critical, to be morally, that's what the Bible is a ferociously morally self-critical book. Look, 1/3 of the Bible are biblical prophets screaming at the king for their immorality. And we preserve that literature. We preserve a literature that points out that David was a vicious adulterer and murderer. We preserve a literature that preserves the flaws of our ancestors. We have no pretensions to think that we're perfect. And that moral self-critique, moral self-awareness is in fact one of the great character traits of the Jewish people. So why wouldn't we create movies like Salah Shabbat and Our Boys and Fauda and Shtisel and all the others, which are going to look at us both critically and there's also a sense of there's also a sense of, and this is why I think your students are responding to this. I think there's something very admirable about a culture that can look at itself self-critically, because a culture that can't, a culture that only produces propaganda.
Yeah.
Who would want to live in such? That's not democracy, and that's certainly not Jewish.
Which is why so many artists are fleeing Russia right now, because
but I wouldn't want to make that comparison. But you're exactly right.
That's what they're saying. How can I make art in this place where they're not asking me to make art? They're asking me to make propaganda. That's not my job.
So how are these things accepted in Israel? Tell us about how they're. You've shown us this, and you've revealed to us, and given us a wonderful guided tour through at least the beginnings of understanding Israeli TV, and we've been watching on Netflix the funny parts. The Baker and the Beauty, I think, is a very funny. The Israeli version, the English version's okay. It's made by a friend of ours, but the Israeli version is much more revealing about Israeli society. Because and its racial issues and its economic issues and its cultural issues. Shtisel is in many ways ferociously self-critical of Israel. How are these things accepted in Israel?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I mean it's very contentious. I would say, you know, there's the underground history of what's happening here, to like in super, you know, like watered down terms, is what Menachem Begin and the Likud, the revolution that they began when they won the election in 77, and it's majority of the years since then has been the Likud government, was to knock down that wall and to kind of call upon the history of Jewish victimhood, and in some ways to kind of make a slushy between pre-state Jewish victimhood and you know, that new Jew was not what they were going for in a lot of ways. And so there's these, you look at the elections, the population is very divided about their own self-identity. And I'll give you one concrete example, Fauda. You can read, if you just Google Fauda, you know, reviews, you can read reviews by Palestinians and by Jews that are, oh, this show is racist, and it's all the ways that it's dismissive or exploitative of Palestinians, or it's like rah-rah for violence against them. Conversely, there's reviews by like right-wing Israeli outlets that are like, this show sympathizes and humanizes these terrorists, and it, you know, it's propaganda. The PLO couldn't make better propaganda. And there was advertisements for Fauda season 2. They put up these billboards throughout Israel that normally is, if you, I will, since the nation state law, I know they changed some of this, but you know, every sign would have Hebrew, Arabic, English, right? You know, the highway signs. So they put up billboards for Fauda that were just in Arabic. And the Arabic was very simple, like the thrills return, or like season 2 is on its way. And people were calling the police because they were so scared. What are these signs in Arabic? This is like Hamas, this is terrorism. And a few mayors in Israel asked Fauda to take the signs down because it was scaring people too much. You know, so is it racist against Palestinians? Is it, you know, is it Hamas propaganda? And of course, it's neither. It's a rich enough text to activate both of those responses, though, and as are many of these texts.
What when in the early years, in the Ben Gurion years, when there really either wasn't television or there was just Channel 1, what was the motivation? Why was it suppressed? What was the concern with having free television, you know, free and open media?
Well, by the way, you have to keep in mind, you weren't allowed to possess American dollars. The Beatles weren't allowed to be played at a certain point. It wasn't quite the Iron Curtain, but there was an element of hostility to the capitalist West as a source of kind of cultural corruption. But it is interesting. So what's the first dramatic program that is aired on Israeli television was Siach Lochamim. So what's Siach Lochamim? In 67, after 67, a bunch of young kibbutzniks went around the kibbutzim, interviewed the people who fought in 67. They were interviewing their fellow veterans, basically veterans interviewing veterans, talking about what was it like. And a lot of them were saying some really critical stuff like, this is not the Israel that I know, or we did horrible things. You know, a lot of, you could imagine what some, you know, and other people were saying that this is awesome, you know, but a very mixed bag of reactions. And they published that in a book. Amos Oz was one of the interviewers, a young man at the time, maybe late 20s. They filmed an adaptation of that, and that was the first drama that was ever aired on Israeli TV. So you talk about self-criticism, or you talk about you know, criticizing the creation of occupied territories or whatever. That was Channel 1, you know, first program. And it was met with, you know, like Menachem Begin and his people did not like it. But that's what happened.
And then the other thing I think that we need to point out to everyone who's listening is, I was in Israel a couple of years ago, and we had an Airbnb apartment with a television, and it got up in the morning, and well, we were getting ready to go off to our day of work or class. It turned on the TV, and there's a morning show which is every bit as fluffy as any American morning show. I mean, the only difference is that the hosts are wearing very casual clothes, and it's like turning on a morning show in Visalia or Fresno or, in some small town, talking to each other, and they bring on a guy who has a new recipe for God knows what, and there's a woman who's a weight loss expert, and there's someone who's going to give you tips on how to raise your kid, what to do with your kids over the coming school vacation. And I watch this, and unfortunately, you've taught me, Ethan, so I watch these things with a critical literary eye, and to say, this is the Zionist dream.
Yeah.
There's nothing moral about this. There's nothing political. There's not the Jewish people's identity and future is not at stake in whether I can cook a pineapple on upside down cake, especially if I can do it in a small pot because I have a small oven. This is normal life being lived in Hebrew by Jews living in their own state. And there is a whole film genre of Israeli films which don't make the Academy Awards because they're not serious artistic creations. They're just fun films about people living life. Yeah. Take a moment about that, because I think this is important for people to realize that, while we sit here and we ruminate over the future of Israel and the future of the state and its character and its morality, there's a life going on where people are just like raising their kids and going to school and playing soccer or softball in the afternoon and going to Weight Watchers and
100%. I forgot which really important Zionist I don't think it was Ben Gurion himself, maybe it was, but one of them said, we will succeed if there's Jewish prostitutes. But what he meant, like Jewish criminals, Jewish, lowlives. Like, this should be a country in everything that means. So it's also going to mean like trashy TV, and there's a certain thing with the films that do well in the festivals. Some people say they kind of exoticize what does Israel have that's unique. Ultra-Orthodox people, it has a conflict, But for sure, Israelis are TV junkies. I think they watch more TV. They read more and they watch more TV. I don't know where they have the time. They must not sleep as much than the global average. And by the way, the leaders of 3 of the major Israeli political parties were TV hosts. They weren't like creating avant-garde art. They were, Yair Lapid had kind of a late night talk show, and Merav Michaeli and Nitzan Horowitz from Labor and Meretz were journalists. I think their journalists are a little bit more, if anyone here is a journalist, not you, but there's the level of discourse is, I think, a little bit more sophisticated than what we have on TV here, but they're taken seriously as politicians. It's not like, there's mass entertainment goes right into public life.
Well, that I think is a very interesting observation. I mean, when I was a student there, which was many years ago, the most popular show on TV, besides the American shows, were the talk shows, and there was serious, like prime time. Like it would be like if Meet the Press were on prime time TV, network TV at 9 o'clock at night, and you'd watch the conversation on the TV, and then you'd go to a local cafe and continue the conversation, and because that was part of the political discourse of the country. It was Herzl, by the way. Elise is right. And Theodore Herzl said, we'll know we have a real country when we have pickpockets and prostitutes. And I got to tell you that my very first visit to Israel with my family in 1970, the last 2 nights we were there, the travel agent booked us into a hotel in a rather seedy section of Tel Aviv. So my father and I would go out for a walk every night, and he turned to me and said, son, we indeed have our own country. And the wonderful thing was that these young women who were out there, making us a real country, they disappeared on Friday night. On Friday night, they disappeared. And so the next night they were back, and my pop, who talks to everybody, stopped and said, like, Eifa Hayit, where were you last night? And she said, Ma, bati le'ima. I went to my mother's house, So we have hookers and pickpockets, but on Friday night, they all go home to make Shabbos. And that's the Jewish state. Professor Ethan Pack of UCLA, it's been a joy to learn with you these 3 sessions. Thank you for being with us. And thank you to everyone who's been with us as well. I want to remind you that next week, we will be joined by Professor Dr. Rachel Korazim. Actually, she'll be in Israel. She's going to get up really early in the morning to teach us about Yom HaShoah, and then we'll conclude the following with Yom HaTzmaut. This has been a wonderful series. Ethan, I want to thank you both for your wonderful teaching, and as well for your guidance and encouragement, inspiration, and help as Alana and I put this series together. It really means a great deal to us. And Mazel Tov on your brother's wedding, and Chazak v'Amatz, enjoy this wonderful time. And to everyone, Hag Sameach, enjoy the rest of your Pesach. Go finish the macaroons, because like the manna, if you don't finish them on Passover, they disappear after that. So finish all the macaroons and enjoy the rest of Pesach. And we certainly hope to see you next week and in all of our future sessions.